Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt.Pillar.
And I'm Ben Comer.
And a few weeks ago, we were pleased to meet veteran biotech builder Dr. Jim Doherty, a neurobiologist who spent 11 years as director of neuroscience at AstraZeneca before joining the biotech startup ranks in 2012 with the then very young Sage Therapeutics, and who about a year ago joined Acumen Pharmaceuticals as president and chief development officer.
On today's show, we'll get to know Dr. Doherty and we'll learn about his lifelong and unrelenting commitment to neuroscience. We'll dig into the challenging and sometimes controversial business of developing therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease, and we'll learn how Acumen intends to differentiate with its unique antibody-based approach.
Dr. Doherty, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Ben. I'm very happy to be here today.
We're thrilled to have you here today. And the place I want to start is with your, as Ben said, unrelenting commitment to neuroscience. We've interviewed hundreds of biotech builders, founders, MDs, PhDs, executives, CEOs on this podcast, and it is very uncommon, if not close to unheard of, to have the opportunity to interview someone who has been as singularly focused in an area of science, a research space, as you have for so many years. You earned your Ph.D. in the early 1990s, and you've been in neuroscience R&D ever since. So I want to start there. I want to gain an understanding of why you are so steadfastly committed to addressing brain health.
Sure. Well, you're exactly correct. I've spent my career working to develop new therapeutics for brain disorders and thinking about brain health. I think there's a couple of different reasons why I've worked in this space for so long and more or less exclusively, but I think probably the place to start would be that there's just so much need for new therapeutics, CNS disorders. And of course, we'll talk today mostly about neurology and things like neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's disease, but there's also quite a diversity of patient groups that need help in CNS disorders. So I also think when you're talking about neurology, about things like seizure disorders, when you think about psychiatry, mood disorders like major depression or postpartum depression, schizophrenia, and even in neurodevelopment, autism spectrum disorders. So there's a tremendous breadth of work that's going on to treat CNS disorders, and that's certainly kept my interest and attention throughout my career. I mean, what we do takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, and it really, at least for me, is pretty motivating to think about the patients that you can potentially help.
Let me throw a quick follow-up onto that question, if you don't mind, Dr. Doherty. You mentioned the breadth of disorders that can be addressed. Over the course of your career, I'm assuming you've also worked across a breadth of modalities to address those disorders. Would that be true? Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Is that breadth of, I'm just curious, is that breadth of modalities that's available to address some of these disorders part of your lifelong interest there, or have you sort of found yourself married to some specific approaches?
No, I actually think it's been a fascinating time to be working in therapeutics and biotech in general, because when you look at how much advancement there's been, even just over the course of my career, I've been doing this for a long time, but it hasn't been that long. Small molecules mostly to start, but the rise of large molecules and even genetic and cell-based therapies, the pace at which new learning is happening and that learning is being applied to potential treatments is pretty amazing. I think we're early days in a lot of spaces if you're thinking beyond large molecules and small molecules, but I think there will be exciting things to come in the years and decades in front of us that will allow us to address things that just wouldn't have been possible to address with approaches that were available even 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and following on that, Dr. Doherty, what's your approach in terms of indication and modality? Is it you identify an indication with unmet need and then you go out and find the best modality to hit that target, or vice versa? Do you discover a drug and then, see where it might, be applicable and determine which, therapeutic area or which indication is the right fit?
Yeah, across my career, I've actually done it both ways. And I think it's fairly common that people take different approaches. I mean, there are mechanisms and targets that people are aware of that we know have meaningful clinical benefits. And so, being able to optimize interacting with that target is a pathway you want to be able to go after. But there are also times when you take the approach of saying, these are the patients I'm trying to help, and how can we get there? How can we really find the right way to go? And I think for a lot of large molecule approaches, there was a time when you just couldn't do some of these things with small molecule approaches. And so being able to now access targets that you couldn't access before has been a huge thing that's happened with large molecules in CNS. And so it really does depend on the approach you want to take. And in my experience, both can be viable, either starting with the target or starting with a disorder and trying to figure out which of the things that are going to be most beneficial for those patients.
Yeah, right. And new indications too. I mean, I think, Dr. Doherty, you worked on one of the first approved drugs for postpartum depression, which, that was 2030, I believe, when that was first approved. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. But when did that kind of indication even, pop onto your radar as a clearly an unmet need that, needed a therapy?
Yeah, it's a really great example. So at the time, Sage Therapeutics was starting from a target-related approach. So we knew that we had a novel way of interacting with these GABA-A receptors, one of the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter systems in the brain. So well known that that system was meaningful clinically for a bunch of different patients. But to your point, there was also some parallel work going on showing that the particular way we are interacting with these receptors, an endogenous pathway that's already in the brain and was implicated in postpartum depression. And so we really came at it from the perspective of, we know that we want to go after this mechanism, but there are a number of different patient populations and indications that you'd see benefit. And we had some clinical evidence that that postpartum depression could be one of those. And I will always remember the results of our first blinded clinical trial, where we actually saw indeed that you could have a rapid beneficial effect in postpartum depression with Zulresso, this medication that targets GABA-A receptors. So yeah, it's a great example of taking that target-based approach, but aligning it with clinical information and identifying patient populations that hadn't been tried before.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. We're going to turn over to Alzheimer's disease, the disease we think of when we hear neurodegenerative disease. When we think about the Alzheimer's therapeutic landscape, over the course of your time in the space, there's been a real dearth of progress for many, many years prior to the approval of lecanemab, now donanemab, and aducanumab. What kept you motivated during so many years of the industry's clinical failure?
Yeah, it's an amazing story of perseverance, and I can't take too much personal credit for it because I've moved around in and out of different therapeutic areas over the years. Some of my original work was in the Alzheimer's disease space, and I've always kind of kept a hand in. But as I've been re-engaging with the space through Acumen, I'm sitting and talking and listening to a number of investigators who have spent literal decades going after how to treat this disorder. And it's an amazing story, and it's amazing to be able to see the perseverance paying off, because it's been, to your point, decades where a lot of effort has been put into treatments for AD. And of course, you draw the distinction, right? There have been a number of therapies that treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And there's been some success there, limited success, but some success. But being able to interfere with the progression of disease and actually slow down the progress of the symptoms for someone just wasn't feasible. And over a number of years, a large number of companies made an effort using biologics, antibodies, to target some of these key systems that we know are going wrong in Alzheimer's disease. And early attempts didn't work. And it's a space where you're talking about showing improvement over time, which means for clinical trials, running relatively long clinical trials to show that people have not declined as much. It's a progressive disorder, and so there are people that are at different stages of progression at any given time. And there are plenty of stories about companies and sponsors running trials where in the end, the trial itself didn't work, which was devastating to all the people involved, certainly the patients involved, but also all of the investigators. But people learned. And I think the part that's amazing is that people have applied that learning sequentially and stayed with it. And that's part of the reason why the recent approvals of lecanemab and donanemab, and starting with aducanumab, were so amazing and such a change for the field.
Yeah, even with those approvals, though, and how they buoyed the space, I want to get your perspective on some of the, I don't know if controversy is even the right word. I think it is. I mean, like with aducanumab, there was there was some, I guess, criticism post-approval around efficacy data, around, the finite number of patients that were seeing benefit. And a lot of that, I don't want to dredge all of it back up. I mean, it played out over the course of a year or so, a couple of years ago. But I'm interested in your perspective on it, given that you're, now working on the development of an antibody in the Alzheimer's space. What do you, what's your take? What do you make of that criticism and sort of the detractors who've questioned those approvals?
Yeah, and you're right. That story has been covered quite a bit, and I think a lot of things happened in that case. I think fundamentally what you're seeing is the challenges of blazing a new trail, and you see definite evidence that you're helping patients, but you're also seeing real limitations. And without going into the whole thing, and I'm sure you know the story. Some trial data positive, some trial data not positive. That's not that uncommon, especially in your early attempts to treat a population. And so fundamentally, that's my take on it, is that we're now seeing some therapies being approved that have been demonstrated to have a meaningful effect on the rate at which people are declining. Now, is that a cure? No, of course not. And I think the people involved with those programs know it's not a cure, but it's that first step that really can show that these processes and these approaches that we're taking can have meaningful effects for patients. And that's the way I think about it. There's plenty of room to improve from here, but being able to take that first step is, I think, sometimes underappreciated for just how hard it is.
Yeah, for sure. And just a quick follow-up to that on this topic, and then we can move on. But I'm just curious about your take on like why maybe that kerfuffle, if you will, was seemingly more magnified than it would have been maybe in another indication, right? Like another indication where a drug's approved on maybe limited or even questionable efficacy data that doesn't get such splashy headlines and get so much noise around the controversy. It seemed like it was a sort of a bigger mainstream story with that approval. Is it because we're talking about an indication that is so widespread, touches everyone, sensitive? I mean, do you think that that's what contributed to the noise around that?
I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, when you think about the patients in need, and look, part of the reason I got into neuroscience is because I have my own family members who have challenges associated with various types of disease in CNS, not specifically Alzheimer's disease, but I have spoken with many, many people, friends, family, people that I've interacted with since coming to Acumen. And the stories are heartbreaking. It really is. It's a terrible thing to happen to both the person, but also to the family. And that generates a huge amount of interest in being able to treat this disorder. And I think, that probably contributes to the salience of it.
Mm.
Yeah, I wanted to ask too about kind of the role of biomarkers. You referenced the difficulty of, progressing of disease for a long time. It was really difficult to get even a good diagnosis. If you go back some years, and now we have, the amyloid beta biomarker, which has been very beneficial to drug developers. Are you fairly confident at this point, Dr. Doherty, that the so-called amyloid hypothesis is legitimate? We know for sure that amyloid, is a primary player in the progression of Alzheimer's disease. That seemed to be in question almost, around the approval of Aduhelm.
Yeah, and I think that that's back to not simply Aduhelm, but those decades of work that I mentioned earlier where therapy after therapy was not working. And of course, part of the challenge in any drug development is it the target that you're working on that's going to be beneficial or not? Or is it just the approach that you're taking or the particular drug you're working with? And when you're in the middle of it, you don't know the answer to that. And so, of course, after a number of lack of successes, you start to question, well, maybe this target is not as important, or it isn't important in the ways that we think it's important. But I think the more recent data does give pretty compelling evidence that amyloid is involved in the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. I think it's also clear it's not the only thing involved. And that's part of this shift in going to the future that, okay, now we have some firm ground. And the question is, how do you expand out from this firm ground into understanding what's really going on in the brain for folks who are dealing with this disorder?
In a previous conversation, you referred to recent progress with Alzheimer's therapeutics as a beachhead that changed the conversation from can we address this disease to how do we optimize the way we're addressing this disease? I wonder if you could explain what you meant by that and where you see biotech contributing to the answer.
Yeah, I that's exactly right. I do think that, and a beachhead is probably the right way to put it, because, it's this moments when you're able to show, okay, we have evidence that we're benefiting patients for real, that in clinical trial data, large clinical trials, lots of investment, lots of time being taken, that you're benefiting patients. And so when you have that, couple that with, and we can talk about biomarkers, you mentioned them just a minute ago. I think it's a really important thing to mention. There's a lot of new information that makes this more tractable. And I think when people are looking at developing new therapies, one of the things you're looking at is, okay, is this something that we can provide some benefit to? And having those initial successes allows people to say, okay, here's the path, but we can do better than this. And so this is what we can do to differentiate from what's already been done. It sounds like a relatively straightforward thing, and maybe it is, but the reality is that the investment in producing a new therapeutic in any patient population is substantial, and you really want to have that firm ground to build from. So that's where I think we are. And I think the field in general, as I re-engage with people, it's an exciting time in that people are now looking at the progress that's been made and saying, okay, I see what we want to do next. How about we look at this? How about we look at this combination? How about we understand this biomarker population as a population that may do better on the treatment than others might do? And so you start to ask all those kinds of questions, which is really about trying to match the right patient to the right treatment. And until you get an active treatment, you really can't even start that process.
Right.
Your depth of, I'm sorry, Ben, did you have something else there?
No, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Your depth of knowledge in the space. I mean, obviously your expertise in neuroscience speaks for itself. You're educated there, but your depth of knowledge in the therapeutic approach in the space is also sort of an uncommon thing in a biotech landscape that, I don't want to say it's dominated, but it certainly features, VC turned biotech CEO types, which I've spent plenty of time. Nothing against it. Like there's some great ones out there. But when I look at a potential guest for the business of biotech, as I mentioned from the outset, I look for things that are unique and different to me. And your unrelenting commitment to this space was one. Another was your title, your president and chief development officer at Acumen. And that's not a title combination, I would say, that we see. Sure, we have MD, PhDs who are founders and CEOs and presidents of the companies we talk to. But maybe not, as specifically as chief development officer. So I'm just hoping you can unpack a little bit about what that means. It appears to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're like the CEO or the president who's got the, a foot in the C-suite and a foot maybe in the lab.
Yeah, well, so I do think that my career, I've had some amazing opportunities, and being able to build a biotech company from the ground up. It's more than just one piece, right? It's more than just, is this the right program, or is this the right drug candidates, or is this the right trial? You have to string all those pieces together. And I see my role and the benefit that I have of being able to have gone through that process from the very beginning. So you mentioned Sage Therapeutics. When I joined Sage, there were about 10 of us, and we were just getting started. We had some really, as it turned out, good ideas, but not much else. And building a company to be able to take a couple of different therapies all the way from the lab through the clinic into the marketplace, amazing experience. And one thing you learn is a small group of people that are motivated and all pulling in the same direction could do some pretty cool things. But you also learn that nobody can do it by themselves, and the value of a team. And I think, that's what I see with going to Acumen, is bring some of that thinking and to take what we think is a really exciting potential therapy for Alzheimer's disease, building off of all of that initial work that we were talking about just a minute ago, but then showing how you can match that to the right patients and maybe take the next step. And I think that's the perspective that I bring, because that's what I've learned from stepping through a process from the beginning of the lab through the end of the clinic. And that's what I'm hoping to bring, and I hope I am bringing to Acumen as we move forward with our treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Sabirnetug.
Let me jump on a quick follow-up to that, because when I see chief development officer, I can read that one of two ways. Like you're certainly qualified to be a chief drug development officer. In your role as president, you're also responsible for business development in many ways. Like that rolls up to you. Coming out of your studies in neuroscience, your time in pharma, your time at Sage, what would you kind of point to as the inflection points that enabled you or empowered you to wrap your mind around more than the development of science, but the development of a business, raising funds, managing people? And I know that that's inviting a big conversation, but if we could identify just a couple of inflection points. We have a lot of listeners who are perhaps aspirational scientists who aspire, right, to go into business, either to run their own companies or to just move into the business side of the companies they work for now. What does it take? What did it take for you? What were some of those inflection points?
Yeah, and there were multiple inflection points. And that's, I think, part of the message is that you've got to go through those transitions. It's another way to say it would be the best, even if you've got an ideal potential therapy, that's no guarantee that you're going to be able to get successfully through the whole process. It's a substantial process, both in terms of science, but as you say, also in terms of having a clear vision that you can articulate to potential investors, being able to make the case for why a particular approach is going to benefit patients, and to be able to continue to deliver those results as the story grows and as the asset gets farther and farther along. It's not straightforward, and the scientific training that a lot of us get, fantastic, but it doesn't teach you that. And so I think that is part of running any company, but certainly running a small growing biotech company, is being able to marry those two things together, to make the right choices, do the right thing from the scientific and the medical perspective, but also be able to do it in a way that will allow you to gain and maintain support for your program. And whether that's investors or whether that's employees or collaborators or vendors, there are many, many different audiences.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, if there are any, maybe specific resources or people or experiences that you leaned into. I mean, some folks who are maybe in the position you were in at Sage, decide, well, I guess I better go get my MBA, or I guess I better really lean into a mentor who can teach me the business side of biotech. Were there any sort of key moments or points or resources like that for you along the way?
No question. And for me, I think it was more finding those mentors and finding those folks who had some of this experience before. No substitute for that. I think I didn't take the pathway of going for an MBA or something like that. And then, as you say, people do that, and I'm sure you get benefit from that as well. But for me, it was finding those mentors and those folks who make you think about things a different way. Take the knowledge that you have and learn to apply it in a slightly different way. And again, that's the kind of thing that that's where the growth comes in. And honestly, that's where it's most exciting too, is where you can take what you've already learned and think about it in a new way.
Yeah. Well, Ben, I could sit here asking Dr. Doherty these soft questions about management skills and capabilities and that kind of thing, but let's take it towards the therapeutic candidate that Acumen's working on.
Yeah, let's. Acumen's lead candidate is a monoclonal antibody called Sabirnetug. Am I saying that right? Sabirnetug?
You are indeed.
Sabirnetug. I wonder if you could explain that drug, Dr. Doherty, kind of how it's differentiated from other amyloid-targeting antibodies in the space. So we've named, I think, the ones that have been approved.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to, Ben. And I think probably the place to start is where the common ground is. It is a monoclonal antibody. It's an IgG2 based antibody that is targeting amyloid, this protein that we know is dysfunctional in Alzheimer's disease. So that's the similarities part. I think one of the things that's a challenge in the field is that amyloid can assume lots of different shapes and sizes. And that's a very long conversation, but there are different forms of amyloid that are interacting with various parts of brain circuitry and brain function. And so one of the questions in the space is, okay, amyloid, clearly a bad actor in Alzheimer's disease, but is it the large plaques that are visible post-mortem and actually was part of the original diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease by Aldous Alzheimer? Or is it these smaller fragments that are different shapes, sizes, and do different things? So I'm paraphrasing a larger body of work, but what we have targeted at Acumen is something called soluble oligomers. These are relatively small forms of amyloid protein, but ones that there's plenty of evidence that preclinically showing that they cause toxicity. And, not surprisingly, that's for us something that is a highly relevant point. So you can show impairment of synapses, you can show impairment of cognition with these small soluble oligomeric forms of A beta. They're not primarily a target for a number of other approaches, but Sabirnetug is specifically targeted and raised against these soluble A beta oligomers. And so that's the piece that we think is going to be a key differentiation point for Sabirnetug moving forward.
So you're differentiated in terms of target. What about something like administration? I think you have a subcutaneous version in a partnership with Halozyme. I imagine is there any sort of other aspects that would contribute to creating a differentiated product in Sabirnetug?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways to think about differentiation. As with most large molecule therapeutics, it's hard to do in oral routes. It doesn't survive the transit through the gut, and it's hard to absorb into the bloodstream for the most part. And so you go to more systemic routes of administration, starting with IV administration. So our current clinical trials are with an IV administration of Sabirnetug, as is the case for the approved drugs at this point as well. But we and others are looking at how to broaden the reach of these therapies to different patients. And if you think about it, although yes, one can go and have an IV infusion and people do it every day, there are some barriers that come with that, and there are some inconveniences that come with that. So being able to produce a subcutaneous formulation where you could use an autoinjector or some other subdermal delivery system would make a lot of sense for a lot of patients, but certainly make a lot of sense for Alzheimer's patients. So we are very interested in being able to produce a subcutaneous form of Sabirnetug as well. So we're kind of developing both. Our lead program and our Altitude AD phase 2 study is using an IV formulation, and we would anticipate going to market with the IV formulation. But part of the vision is fairly quickly to be able to have subcutaneous option for Sabirnetug as well. So that's one way to differentiate. And I think the other ways that you generally think about are from the efficacy point of view. We talked about that a little bit. And then the last way is from the safety tolerability point of view. There are, for the benefits of these approaches, there are also some target-specific challenges that come in. And this is the Alzheimer's-related imaging abnormalities, or ARIA. That seems to be a challenge for a number of different potential therapeutics. It's a challenge for the approved therapeutics. And, we think the challenge will be there as well for Sabirnetug, given that this is related to the target. But we do think that the approach that we're taking with these small soluble oligomers, the hypothesis is that there will be less risk for these ARIA-related events. And so we see a couple of different ways that we could differentiate. And I think it's back to this concept we were talking about at the beginning. Once you've got some firm ground under your feet, then you can think about, okay, this is the way to take the next step. It could be from an efficacy point of view, or from the safety point of view, or potentially both.
Right. And in the ARIA, you're talking about like brain swelling, brain bleeds, that sort of thing.
Correct.
What about on patient eligibility? Is it a similar kind of diagnostic for the target you're going after as with some of the other approved drugs? Is it different? Is it a smaller or larger patient population that would be eligible for Sabirnetug?
Yeah, so at the moment, we are looking at a similar patient population. So we're talking about early Alzheimer's disease. These are the patients who either have mild cognitive impairment, about 5 million or so in the U.S. at the moment, and folks who have the mild dementia, the early part of Alzheimer's disease, another 2 million or so of those. So that's about 7 million people in the U.S. that fall under this early Alzheimer's designation. I think one of the things that's very exciting about the field that we haven't talked about yet is, as we mentioned the trials and how much learning has accumulated over the past couple of decades, one of the things that has been accumulating rapidly is knowledge about biomarkers, fluid-based biochemical biomarkers. And what people have learned is that although the signs, the clinical signs of Alzheimer's disease, the memory challenges and things like that, are occurring relatively late in life, typically. The changes in the brain are occurring years to, in some cases, decades before those clinical symptoms show up. And so it really does open up the possibility to say, okay, can you use these biomarkers to identify the patients who are going to be best suited for this therapy or that combination of therapies? And can you identify patients who are going to respond well and perhaps have better tolerability? So there's a tremendous amount of work going on in parallel to the therapeutic development in biomarker developments that is going to help with diagnostics. So both identification of patients earlier in their personal journey, but also hopefully being able to link patients to the therapies that are going to be best suited for them. You think about, and I know you know that space, oncology. I mean, that's been a huge effort over this sort of similar period of time in oncology, is to take all these new therapies and identify which are the best patients to respond. I think something like that will be coming for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. I think, to be humble about it, we're at the very early stages of that. But I do think that that's a realistic thing to think that panels of plasma, blood-based biomarkers are going to be useful to be able to help guide patients and match patients to treatments.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. On invasiveness of the diagnostic too, right? How hard is it to find out whether a patient has this or that abnormality? Do you see, I guess, talking about biomarkers, fluid biomarkers, is the CNS space, would you say that it lags behind oncology in that regard? Is it possible for it to catch up? Or are they sort of neck and neck? What do you see on the development side in those biomarkers in Alzheimer's or in CNS broadly?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges in CNS is to be able to develop accessible biomarkers that we can use for patients. And that's certainly the case in Alzheimer's disease. We could talk another time about some of the other CNS disorders. It's the same challenge. I think it's hard to compare directly between oncology and CNS, but I would say I don't think it's much of a stretch to say the process of matching therapies and biomarkers is much further along in oncology than it is in CNS or in Alzheimer's disease. But I do think it's coming for neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's.
want to talk a little bit about you mentioned your clinical programs, and I want to talk a little bit about those clinical programs. Before we get into the clinical progress, I'm curious about this. I guess I'll harken back to my reference to your chief business development hat. You just completed recently a phase 1 trial. Now you're in a phase 2 clinical trial, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah. That's for a biotech, that's a very expensive point on the continuum. So I'm curious about how the company has positioned itself to sort of endure the financial rigors of clinical trials. And I'd like you to maybe respond to that question in the context of the greater space. It's not uncommon to have a conversation with someone who's, in the mRNA space or the ATMP, like cell and gene therapy space, or whatever the space du jour is, who it doesn't really matter what they're doing. They can't help but to run into money, right? This space has a unique context in that there has been some recent progress. There have been some recent antibody-based approvals, and that's got to have some sort of a dynamic effect on the fundraising community, the capital that's available. And I'm just curious about it. I don't know what that dynamic effect is. That's what that's what I'll ask you. So yeah, sort of a two-part question. How has Acumen specifically prepared itself to sustain the rigors of clinical trials from a financial perspective, and what's that been like in the current market?
Right. Yeah, I think to the first part, it's about being deliberate and being efficient with capital management and allocation. I mean, and it's, there's nothing magic about that. I think it is the process of understanding what it is that you need to do and being very rigorous and careful about prioritizing the right things to focus on. Because, drug development is a sequential process, and you've got so many steps to take over time. You've got to take the right steps in the right order. And in order to do that, you need the resources, but you need to manage those resources very, very carefully. So we, like a lot of companies, spend a lot of time in making sure that we've got the right sequence of activities at the right time, and that we're investing in the pieces that you need to invest in. And I think this is one of the benefits of working in a previous biotech company that grew from a small company to a commercial stage company, because you see that sequence in action, and you can do the right things in the wrong order and not succeed. And so it's not just doing the right things; it's being very careful with your capital and being able to sort of carefully manage things. And for Acumen, end of September, we're at about $259 million, and so we've got the resources that we need to be able to progress our programs. But nobody has endless resources, and if you're not careful, you can get yourself out of sequence and into trouble. So we spend a lot of time being sure that we've got the right path and that we're staying on that path. And then I think the second question around funding environment, it's interesting for CNS. It's a challenging time for biotech. We all know that, and that's a macro economic thing, that it's a challenging time right now, and it has been for a little while. I think it's a little bit of a lagging indicator. My hope is that we start to see people looking towards healthcare and towards CNS therapeutics as opportunity for the future. There's no question in CNS there's a tremendous amount of unmet medical need to try to bring treatments for. And it's my hope that some of these exciting changes that we're talking about, some of this progress in the biomarkers and really being able to maybe use oncology as a model and link the right patients to the right treatments. We haven't been able to do that too much to date. And so it's my hope that becomes attractive to investors, to be able to see that those tools are developing, and couple that with some of the recent successes that we've seen in the treatment of Alzheimer's. Yeah, the future's bright, and the opportunity is there. So, it's back to, as you mentioned earlier, the business of managing a company. You have to have the right ideas, you have to have the right approaches, but you also have to be able to articulate a vision and have the right funding environment to be able to raise the resources.
Yeah. A quick follow-up on the first part of your response to that question around doing the right things in the wrong order and potentially creating some challenges for yourself. I know that's not prescriptive. This is going to be another sort of fuzzy, open-ended, vague question because I know that's not prescriptive. Like I can't ask Jim Doherty to spell it out for our aspirational listeners. Well, here's the order of things. You do these things in this order, it's going to be okay. But I can ask you to maybe offer some advice around the awareness of navigating, the order of things, right? Like, it's just such a tough question to ask. I know it's not all gut and intuition. There's got to be some advice you can offer there around like, it helps if you pay attention to X. We'll talk to so-and-so.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I do think there are some things that I could offer generically. And I mean, if for people who are listening, one of the things that is hardest to do, but is the most valuable, is to be able to see the entire R&D process. And what I mean by that is, developing a new medicine, you start with an idea. You have a lot of work to do to show that your particular molecule fits the bill. You've got to be able to convince the regulators to allow you to start clinical trials. You've got to go through clinical trials. You've got safety and manufacturing issues. And I could go on for a while. It's the statistics say it's a 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 year process to be able to go from the beginning to a marketed drug. And we won't even talk about the success rates because they're not high. So that sounds pretty daunting, and it can be. But one of the things that I think is most valuable is to be able to see beyond the horizon, because, this idea of doing the right things in the right order, it's not so much that you couldn't figure it out, but if you don't know the question you're going to be addressing 2 years from now, you might address 3 questions today because it feels like these are important questions and I'll spend my resources answering these 3 questions. When the reality is 2 years from now, you're going to be answering a new question that you don't even have to worry about today, but it will guide your decision-making and the way you think about staging your resources. It's one of the hardest things to do because we're all trained in a particular part of the process. And it's one of the things that I'm most grateful for is in my career, I've been able to sort of see it from the beginning of R to the end of D. And that also, by the way, applies to the commercial side of things or to the regulatory side of things. Being able to be able to see beyond that horizon is really important. And yeah, you can't intuit that. You've got to talk to people. You've got to make some connections with people who have been there or are used to thinking about a different part of the process than you are and kind of grow that awareness. That's probably the thing that's the most helpful in addressing these things when they come up. Obviously, every individual program, it's a different story and there are different challenges. But in almost every case that I can think of, it's being able to know where you're going and to know what questions you're going to be addressing 2 years from now that is the most helpful in setting the path.
That was one of the more satisfactory responses to a poorly worded question that I've ever received in all these years. Dr. Doherty, thank you. It was a great response.
Well, thank you.
Before we let you go, Dr. Doherty, I wonder if you could share. You mentioned you've entered in phase 2 clinical trial. Could you give us a sense of the clinical progress and maybe next steps for Acumen and for your clinical program?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Ben, so we're running the Altitude AD clinical trial, which is a phase 2 efficacy trial. Trying to follow up on the results that we have from our phase 1 study, where we're looking at 2 different doses of Sabirnetug, 35 and 50 mg per kg, once monthly administration over an 18-month period. What we're looking for is the ability to, for the first time, show a clinical benefit, meaning an improvement in the rate of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients. So the study is a relatively large global study, 540 subjects across 3 different arms. And the goal is to demonstrate the efficacy and safety and tolerability of Sabirnetug. It will be a very critical study for the company. And we hope, a next step forward for the treatment in AD. But it would be for the first time to be able to take the biomarker data that we gathered in phase 1 and match it to what we hope to be robust efficacy data in the phase 2 study.
When do you anticipate that phase 2 study being completed?
So the study started enrolling in 2024. So we are working our way through enrollment at this point, which is going quite well. We have not yet announced when we will complete enrollment, although what we have said is we expect to complete enrollment sometime in the first half of 2025. And so given that it's an 18-month primary endpoint after that, so 18 months from when we could complete enrollment in the first half of 25 is the rough time frame.
And then you said the subcutaneous administration was on a kind of parallel track, but I think slightly behind. Is it, I guess, where's the status on that? Is that moving into a phase 2 as well, or where does that one stand?
Yeah, so the subcutaneous work is completing a phase 1 study. What we've guided is that we'll be announcing the top line results from the phase 1 sub-Q study in the first quarter of 2025. And at that point, based on the data from the trial, we'll be talking about what the next steps would be. As I said earlier, it's going to be happening sequentially, so we'll be following along with our sub-Q approach. The exact timing is one of these sequencing questions that we were just talking about. So as always, it's going to be data-driven.
Right. Excellent. Matt, anything before we wrap this up?
I'm good. No, I was just thinking this episode is going to drop post JPM. But as we sit here recording, the three of us are all gearing up for JPM next week. And I was just thinking, I hope we run into Dr. Doherty at JPM next week in San Francisco. We'll buy him a beer for giving us such a great interview today.
That sounds good to me, Matt. I look forward to seeing you guys. It's always good to go out to JPM. It's going to be busy, but there's always so much energy and enthusiasm. I'll be looking for you guys.
Yeah, same. We appreciate you coming on.
That's Acumen Pharmaceuticals President and Chief Development Officer, Dr. Jim Doherty. I'm Ben Comer.
And I'm Matt Pillar.
And you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly video casts of these conversations every Monday under the Listen and Watch tab at Life Science Leader. We'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.